Hello, everyone. Welcome to Next Big Future. I'm Brian Wang, your host. Just a bit of background on me. So I've written over 30,000 articles on science and technology for Next Big Future over the last nearly 20 years. Also have a public track record of making pretty accurate predictions on science and technology, the various public predictions, as well as I've participated in the Metaculus prediction site, where I'm a top 80 predictor, which means over 200 some public predictions actually that have resolved where I've been 80% accurate on those, which is a pretty good track record. And I'm also an investor in space, investor in SpaceX, and I've been a member of various angel investment groups, as well as general business investor. I have some corporate finance work in my background, as well as computer science, et cetera. So I have a pretty good technical and business background to assess companies and also look at all the development in future technology and in space. So just some credibility to what I'm going to be giving you in terms of my predictions for the SpaceX Decade. So on to discussing SpaceX, briefly summarizing what they're currently doing, and then going on to discuss what I expect to see happening between now and 2030. So for those who don't follow SpaceX that closely, they are going to be launching about 60 Falcon 9 rockets, and they are on the verge of sending their next generation rocket, the Super Heavy Starship, up to orbit within a month or two, which might fail, but they have the production capacity to try again and again, once a month, and then ramping up to twice a month. It took them about 10 tries to get the upper stage Starship to go to 10,000 feet and then return and land safely. So that 60 launches per year of a Falcon 9, that is basically 90% of the commercial launch market. So they utterly dominate that in terms of the launches that they do. And especially if you look at the payload, they're now, some of the other competing launches are far smaller launches. So they're dominating there, and then they will also dominate with satellites. So they make the Starlink satellite, private communications, for about $100 per month right now, have 250,000 people who have subscribed to that. And they've been adding them about 50,000 per month and increasing, just limited by the mass production capabilities of the receiving satellites that people need to, receiving satellite dishes that people need to have. And they continue to improve that. We'll be ramping up faster and faster. So I think they should have at least 1 million subscribers by the end of the year, which would be well over $1 billion in revenue for that. And this picture shows the version 1.5 Starlink satellite, which now has laser backlinks, so they each can connect up in space with a laser beam, which lasers travel faster. Light travels faster in vacuum than it does through a glass fiber. So that means that 40% extra speed by physics means that latency for the Starlink satellites is lower. So that's just a summary of where they are now. So with 60 launches of the Falcon 9, they'll go from 2,200 satellites now to about 4,000 by the end of this year, which is completing the first shell of 4,400 satellites. And there'll be a total of 12,000 of these smaller 260 kilogram or so satellites, the Starlink generation 1. So this generation 1, and of those generations, it's version 1, version 1.5, et cetera. So there's versions of this first generation. And they filed with the FCC to create a generation 2 satellite that'll be 5 times bigger. So it's about 260 kilograms, it'd be a little over a ton. And they'd be able to launch, instead of 16 of Falcon 9, it'd be 12 of the big ones, 10 of the big ones, using a Falcon 9, but they're going to shift over to the Super Heavy Starship to launch the larger ones. which would be about 100 to 150, depending on how much payload. There's talking about getting up to 230 tons of payload for the Super Heavy Starship, although at least 100, 150 tons seems likely. But also the Super Heavy Starship will be completely reusable. Both first and second stage will land and be reused. Currently, they only reuse the booster stage and recover the pharynx, which is the cover of the payload. So yeah, so that the frequency of launch of Super Heavy Starship will be a huge factor. The fact that they will launch 4 to 8 times more payload than a Falcon 9, and then be able to launch it perhaps multiple times per day in certain cases and applications. So what will that all mean in terms of revenue? So currently they make about $2 billion for launch services, coming up at $1 billion for the Starlink, the $3 billion in revenue. And the valuation is about $130 billion in the latest private funding rounds. This is going to increase. So once you get a lot of those Starlink satellites up and get to 20 million customers, 40 million customers and stuff like that, by 2024, I expect their revenue will exceed NASA's budget. NASA's budget is about $25 billion. Maybe increased to 30 billion. They will surpass that in 2024. And I expect that the Super Heavy Starship will be going regularly to orbit by 2024. It could be happening in 2023. But slippages can happen. But I'm thinking quite confidently 2024 they'll be doing a lot. They've also gotten $150 million from the Air Force and Space Force to do payload 1-hour delivery point to point on Earth, and I expect this to be demonstrated in 2023. Just assuming that you have the Starship functioning, that you only need the upper stage to fly 8,000, 10,000 miles on Earth, and it'd be single stage, no releasing, separating, just everything takes off at once, everything lands at once, nothing is dropped off or anything like that. It can be refueled and reused right away. And by 2025, I expect them to be doing thousands of Super Heavy Starship launches to orbit, because I'll be having a fleet of 10 of those boosters and starships, actually more starships and boosters. I'll discuss that a bit more later. But many launches, thousands to orbit by 2025. So as I said, the Generation 2 largest satellites will scale from 2023 to 2025, get to 30,000 of those, which will allow for them to have 200 million or more customers for the Starlink satellite system, $200 million in revenue, high margin, probably at that point, $50 billion in profit, which with a 50 PE would make them worth about $2.5 trillion. So they'll prove also the safety of the Super Heavy Starship by flying it thousands of times. So if you don't have crashes, then you have a safety rate, how often you crash versus how often you fly. Just like you have actual numbers around, you fly millions of times with passenger aircraft and they don't crash. You don't have to do some calculation of we think it's this safe. That's what they've done for the space shuttle and other space vehicles. So the frequency of the Starship launches, one of the things that's going to increase that a lot is the launch tower, which is called the Mechazilla, which basically has these large arms that will catch each of the stages where they have the grid fins on the 2 stages, the booster and for the upper stage. So by catching each of the stages and helping them land more precisely, then they're right where they need to be to launch. You don't have to they weigh a huge amount, hundreds of tons, especially with fuel, thousands of tons, that it's difficult to move these things. You always see the space shuttle or Apollo on these massive crawlers, these huge tank track things. They're multi-stories tall, moving along 1 mile per hour, and taking days to get where they need to be launched. Having them come onto the Mechazilla means that you can catch them, set them where they need to be, stack them, relaunch in as little as an hour. So, like I said, proving safety. I think they'll have 100 starships, 48 boosters within about 2024, 2025. So 4,000 to 10,000 launches. And then that'll scale to thousands of Starships within 2 or 3 years, 80 boosters, 50,000 to 200,000 launches per year, and then keep going up from there. And then you have safety, 1,000 launches, 10,000 launches in 2025, 100,000 to 1 million launches in 2027. And then this massive launch capability means that you will be able to make giant space stations and enable massive space tourism. So the old orange fuel tank for the space shuttle, there were old designs in the 80s where they would say, let's leave them in orbit and then make large space stations. In large cylindrical ones, circular ones, kind of like the space station in 2001, A Space Odyssey. Those can spin, and then you have gravity. Because the big concern when you have people up in space is low gravity. People, the astronauts have gone up for close to a year, always come back so weak. You have to help them out of the pod where they've been returned, because you lose muscle even if you're trying to go on treadmill and cycling and stuff like that, and you lose your bones get weaker because of low gravity. But if you spin it just like a centrifuge or whatever, you can simulate gravity and get 1G of gravity. The other big concern for space is that you have to have radiation protection. Radiation protection, two things. The bigger it is, the easier it is to protect stuff, because then you have more mass to, more water, more other things to block out radiation. The other thing is if you have it around the equator, and low Earth orbit, then you still have the Earth's magnetic field protecting you and whatever's there from radiation. So large space stations spinning in around the equator can give you 1G, 1G of gravity and radiation protection. And the bigger you make it, whatever it is, the easier it is to protect against the radiation, because you just stick that 2 meters of water, and then you're protected. So, and the other thing is that the Super Heavy Starship is about size, actually bigger than the old orange fuel tank of the space shuttle, and it's bigger than the International Space Station in volume. So every one of them is bigger than the International Space Station, which took 50 launches of shuttles to launch and assemble. So here's a picture of something like 15 or 20 of things about the size of a Starship. And Starship costs, I'm thinking, well, because metal is very, very low cost, they'll be producing high volume, so the labor is low. I've done detailed calculations of how much those costs will be. So 10 million is very doable, getting out of 5 million even for the whole system, which is 30 to 40 times cheaper than a passenger aircraft of similar size, and actually less payload. And the engines, rocket engines, which is like 9 on the Starship, they're going to try and get those down to like $230 each. So then the engine will be like $2.5 million, $3 million. So then this kind of 20 piece space station made out of Starships left in orbit, the actual capital cost of that might only be $200 million, $100 million, because of the cost of mass-produced Starships dropping to $5 to $10 million each. And then because you have so many of these launches, you'll be able to launch mass amounts of tourism. And space tourism already started with the Falcon 9, where they've launched for inspiration for tourists to space. And they're looking to launch like 4 of them a year, so 16 astronauts next year, and then they'll probably just continue to scale up as everything is scaling up. SpaceX has also been given about $3 billion from NASA to develop a lunar version of the Starship, which I expect to land on the moon around 2024, 2025. You'll have an elevator, you have a tiny person there, showing that this thing is landing with 100 tons. Think of like 10 to 20 semis full of stuff, how much you can put in there versus, a small van, a small truck full of stuff for Apollo or something like that. Just you're landing with a lot more. You're landing with 50 times more than Apollo. And you have a giant elevator because you're so many stories up, to lift out your moon vehicle, or and here they picture of 2 moon vehicles coming out. So Tesla and SpaceX both are able to have massive rapid changes compared to existing companies. You can just see how rapidly SpaceX has been developing its rockets, but also Tesla, something that people don't know is, not everyone knows, is that the factories make 20 changes a week. So, and make 1,000 changes a year. It makes significant changes. And also the next vehicle down the line can be different from the one in front of it. How can they make changes that rapidly? How can they test things that rapidly? Is because they have 100% testing. So they can do a software check and say, okay, check everything that's a non-destructive test and confirm that everything works the way we expect it to be. And they can say, okay, yes, it meets higher standards than the regulatory things, so we know this is safe. It's not degraded things. We want to be perfect, but we're willing to play between perfect and well above safety standards, so that we can make changes, making what we think are improvements, and then prove it out completely later on. And SpaceX also had that culture of rapid change. The two companies work together tightly on software, on alloys, etc. So the SpaceX Starlink roadmap. So here's how I see the scaling from the 1 million users I was talking about for Starlink at the end of this year, 3 to 6 million next year, 6 to 15 the year after that, 30 to 100 million. And the key things to jump up above 20 million people globally will be getting that generation 2 set of satellites up. And there could be a delay, 2025, 2026, but I don't think there'll be more than a year delay. And then at that point, you're going to have 200 million users plus, and then you'll launch another generation 3 satellites. I'm expecting that to be even bigger, even more bandwidth. And then instead of 30,000 satellites, 120,000. One of the things is that Starlink has to change out the entire network of satellites every 5 years, because in low Earth orbit, there's still a bit of atmosphere, and you get a bit of drag. All the satellites they put up, the 2,000 now, which can go and skip to 12,000, they will deorbit within 5 years, because they'll run out of fuel, and then they'll burn up the atmosphere. So SpaceX has to keep relaunching the stuff, and they're going to use that to launch bigger and better satellites each time they go, every 5 years, launching new, bigger and better satellites, more technology, etc. Of course, even the 2-3 years that they take to launch everything, or 1 to 3 years, ideally need to do it in 1 or 2, they will be continuing to upgrade as they've shown from version 1, 1.1, 1.2 up to 1.5 for the current batch of satellites. And the revenue is going to scale up to like $1 trillion to $3 trillion just from the Starlink part. And I expect the Starlink to IPO probably in 2024, 2023 probably. They'll have stable enough Starlink revenue that they can go into public markets. And then I expect that to trade at $500 billion plus. Also in the news recently is Elon buying Twitter. I think it will happen. Elon will succeed in getting Twitter. And the valuation, there is some aspects about the free speech thing, but there's also the fact that I think Twitter can, Elon can take Twitter. The current management seems incompetent. But Elon can take Twitter, which is at, about like the 12th or 13th ranked social media site in the world that's shown this list, with about 210 million users, daily users. Reddit has more, Pinterest has more, so it double. So you're getting to double the number of users, even up to the 1 billion level at the TikTok, WeChat level. I think it's perfectly achievable with an upgraded form of Twitter, maybe with video. And thinking with the Starlink bandwidth I talked about, once you get the generation 2 satellites, you can basically move the entire 600 terabits per second of the internet. So Elon will have extra bandwidth that any customers he hasn't sold Starlinks to, he'll have extra bandwidth to move back end data for an Elon-owned Twitter. So with video, short video, you can get into the TikTok, Facebook game, get up to that 1 to 2.5 billion people, 3 billion people. So I fully expect a Elon-owned Twitter with Starlink back end to get into that 2 to 3 billion person customer level. So the generation 2 Starlink is in file path, bigger 1 ton, 60, 80 gigabits per second, probably for each, 30,000 satellites, 500 terabits per second over land, 1,800 terabits, including the ocean coverage, and 600 terabits per second in the entire internet now. So that's the scale of the data of generation 2. So Elon is making more starbases, which are starbases, what they call the launch facilities. They have one, making a second one, and they're also converting 2 oil rigs. And they have a new Raptor engine factory, rocket engines in the Raptors, 1,000 rocket engines per year, which you have 9 engines for each Starship. You're looking at 100 Starships per year. And then I think 5 boosters, each with about like 33 or whatever Raptor engines. The reason you have fewer boosters than Starships is that the boosters can fly every hour, while the Starships have to go to orbit, go around, and only fly once a day, once every 2 days, maybe even less if it has multiple orbits up in space for whatever it's doing. So this is a ratio of 20 to 1, 10 to 1 for boosters relative to Starships. And then the Starship factories are being built now. They're putting 2 factories, probably one in Texas, one in Florida. They can make even more, which is basically having high and mid bays, which in this rendering shown by Lolo Matico and Too Legit to Quit 3D. And they space out based on the size of what they're building, based on drone coverage of what's happening there. They'll be able to make 7 boosters at the same time, or 7 Starships at the same time. And if they complete them every 2 months, it's going to take about 3 months to complete one. They'll be able to get that down to 2 months. And then that means each factory will be boosting about 40, some 42, some Starships or boosters every 2 months. And then, make a 3rd factory and get up to 100 Starships per year pretty easily. Or if you improve it down to like 6 weeks or so for each Starship, you can get to that 100 Starships per year level that were the goal of SpaceX. In the first goal, they're going to continue to make more and more factories. So the boosters caught and flying once per hour means also that the launch towers can be very busy for each booster. So pretty much you need a launch tower for each booster, or at least a launch tower for every 2 boosters. So that's the kind of scaling. You have launch tower and launch facilities, boosters, and then Starships. That's the kind of scaling that we're looking at. And then Starship taking air cargo, like I said, the US military has already funded the first demonstration of this point-to-point air cargo. And then that's a business that's at least 14 times bigger than the current rocket market, where global air cargo is $140 billion. And there's an entirely new, no one else can compete with market for speeding up international delivery, where basically you can shave off the 12 hours it takes to move between continents using a Starship. So then you can have sorting facilities, major sorting facilities on each continent, say 3 in North America, 1 on the East Coast, 1 on the West Coast, 1 in the Midwest. You use regular transportation to bring all the packages as quickly as possible to those sorting stations, and anything that goes international goes from there on Starships to Asia, to Europe, South America, etc. And so you have this area where, just like FedEx had initiated daily delivery, and they didn't have a competitor for many years, SpaceX will also be enabling that kind of factory. They may work with FedEx and with UPS and stuff like that to say, okay, hey, we're going to be enabling you guys to do twice a day delivery to between continents. And that'll be a new business that they'll get a lot of margin out of, because there'll be no other competition. And the rockets go 30 times faster than the planes, and they have 4 times as much payload or more, because large planes can move about 50, 60 tons. And they'll be increasing this with the oil rig launches or other launch facilities that are just away from cities. So I see this like connecting continents first, then major cities, and then going to that fast delivery market, and then competing for the regular market, and then scaling to thousands of flights, and from there moving on to the $600 million air passenger travel market. SpaceX will also go to Mars. So 2024, 2028, we're looking at for an unmanned mission, probably with Tesla bots as well. And then there'll be 2 years later, the manned missions. Sorry, it's unmanned. It's manned missions 2 years after, whenever they do the unmanned missions, and then 4 years later there'll be large fleets of hundreds of starships going all at once during the 2-year launch window. And also you could have a manned mission with just a small crew going with a large fleet of unmanned ships. That could happen, likely happen as well. So summarizing the SpaceX decade and the keys to it: getting the Super Heavy Starship to work, getting into orbit, launching it frequently, Mechazilla having the catch and relaunch. Without the Mechazilla catch and relaunch, then the frequency of launch drops from multiple times a day down to at best twice a week, or maybe once every other day. And then mass production of all things: mass production of factories, mass production of launch towers, mass production of orbital launch towers, mass production of Raptor engines, mass production of starships, mass production of the booster, mass production of the Starlink satellites, even higher mass production than the mass production they have, go to extreme production, and then mass production of the satellite receivers. In each Starlink satellite, there is also solar power panels. The current generation have about 3 kilowatts. The generation 2 will have 20 kilowatts. So when you have 30,000 of the generation 2, the 20 kilowatt hours of solar panels, you have 600 megawatts of power from that. The generation of that, you're looking at gigawatts of power. Also, each one of them have a ion drive for efficient maneuvering and orbit keeping, using less fuel. So they're basically also mass producing ion drives, which could be used for long haul space missions, etc. So all of this capability is growing. The Starlink IPO helped them raise $50 to $100 billion, which is 2 to 4 times the NASA budget. The revenue, because of Starlink, the cargo scaling from 100 to 1,000 times the current $3 billion or $2 billion in revenue. And then generation 2, and then generation 2 plus for the satellites. And then they'll go from currently 60 launches, scale that up 1,000 times, maybe 1 million times even, which 1 million times if you have like 200 boosters, and you have a record number of starships, and the boosters are launching 20 times a day, you're looking at 4,000 launches a day, times 365 days, that's over 1 million. And then you don't have to stop at 200 boosters. If you have 100 times the revenue, 1,000 times the revenue, you can scale up from making 10 boosters, 5 boosters a year, and scale up to 500 or 1,000 boosters to in the limitation of that might be that there's about 30,000 passenger planes, and people have projected 2030 might be 50,000, 60,000 passenger planes. So if you had a similar scale, 10,000 boosters, that would not be inconceivable. You have to look at market demand, usability, and stuff like that to see if they actually, just because you can build it, I mean, you have to have the economics of revenue and stuff to also get that built. And then this also means 10,000 to 10 million times more payload, because each one of these Starship Super Heavies will have far more payload volume. We'll have the moon landings starting about the middle of the decade, and then the development of the moon, because you won't stop with just landing there. You're going to also go back with, because you have so many starships, you'll go back and bring, the colonization of the moon, follow up colonization of Mars, and orbital development and colonization, tourism. So all of these things will happen, especially have this much launch capability. So that is the SpaceX Decade. I also have further videos just updating this as it develops, and also look at if you could achieve this, what happens beyond that to colonization of orbit. So if you enjoy this, please like and subscribe to us on YouTube. You can support us on Patreon. It's the next big future at patreon.com You can follow us on me on Twitter, Nick Big Future on Twitter, and my website, nickbigfuture.com, which also have a newsletter. So thanks for your time, and I hope you enjoyed it, and see you next time.